The sun was just beginning to warm the streets of Los Angeles that Tuesday morning. Margaret Chen adjusted her favorite floral scarf as she stepped out of her small apartment, the same one she'd lived in for over 40 years. At 72, she moved a bit slower these days, but her spirit remained as strong as ever. "Morning, Mrs. Chen," called out her neighbor from across the hall, a young mother bouncing a baby on her hip. "Good morning, dear," Margaret replied with a warm smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Off to the market. Need anything?" The neighbor shook her head, watching as Margaret made her way down the stairs, one careful step at a time. Everyone in the building knew Mrs. Chen still insisted on doing her own shopping, despite her children's offers to help. It was her weekly ritual, her way of staying independent. The local grocery store was just 3 blocks away, a distance Margaret had walked thousands of times. She loved the early morning quiet, the way the city seemed to stretch and yawn before the rush of the day began. Today, she needed to pick up ingredients for her famous dumplings. Her grandchildren were coming over for dinner. As she walked, Margaret hummed an old Chinese lullaby her mother used to sing. She passed the corner cafe where the baristas knew her by name, the bookstore where she volunteered on weekends, and the small park where she practiced Tai Chi with her friends every Thursday. Unknown to Margaret, just 2 blocks away, a film crew was setting up for the day. Vin Diesel, the famous action star, was in town shooting scenes for his latest movie. Between takes, he decided to grab a quick coffee from that same corner cafe Margaret had just passed. His bodyguard, Tony, had stepped away to take an urgent call from the production office, leaving Vin temporarily on his own. The grocery store was already bustling when Margaret arrived. She grabbed a small cart and began her familiar route through the aisles. First, the produce section for fresh vegetables, she carefully selected the greenest bok choy and the firmest mushrooms. Then to the meat counter for ground pork, exchanging pleasantries with the butcher who always saved the best cuts for her. By the time she reached the checkout, her cart was full of ingredients that would soon become a feast. The young cashier helped her pack everything into paper bags, knowing Mrs. Chen preferred them to plastic. "Need any help to your car, Mrs. Chen?" the cashier asked. "Oh no, dear. I walked here," Margaret replied, lifting the bags with practiced determination. "These old arms still have some strength left in them." She made her way to the exit, the weight of the groceries already making her arms ache. But Margaret was stubborn in the best way. The kind of stubbornness that had helped her raise 3 children alone after her husband passed, the kind that had seen her through tough times and made her who she was. As she stepped into the parking lot, the morning sun momentarily blinded her. She paused to adjust her grip on the bags, not noticing the 3 young men lounging near the shopping cart return. They were watching her struggle, whispering among themselves, their laughter carrying an edge that would have made anyone uncomfortable. Margaret continued walking, focused on the familiar path home. She didn't see the first young man nudge his friend and point in her direction. She didn't hear their snickers growing louder. All she knew was that her arms were tired, her feet hurt a little, and she couldn't wait to get home and start cooking. Little did she know that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become anything but ordinary, and that her simple trip to the grocery store would soon make headlines across the country. The 3 young men had been hanging around the parking lot for about an hour, bored and looking for entertainment. They wore expensive sneakers and designer jeans, their phones constantly in hand as they scrolled through social media. The tallest one, wearing a backwards baseball cap, was the first to spot Margaret struggling with her groceries. "Hey, check this out," he whispered to his friends, nodding toward the elderly woman. A cruel smile spread across his face as an idea formed in his mind. Margaret was halfway across the parking lot when she felt someone bump into her shoulder, hard enough to make her stumble. The paper bags in her arms shifted dangerously. "Oops, sorry, Grandma," the young man said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Didn't see you there. Maybe you should watch where you're going." His friends burst out laughing as if he'd said something incredibly clever. Margaret steadied herself, her heart racing from the near fall. She taught high school for 35 years and recognized bullies when she saw them. "Excuse me," she said quietly, trying to step around them. But they moved to block her path. "What's the rush?" the second one asked, reaching out to poke at one of her bags. "Got a hot date or something?" The third young man, shorter but stockier than his friends, circled around behind her. Maybe we should help you with those bags. They look pretty heavy for such a little old lady. Before Margaret could respond, he gave one of her bags a deliberate push from behind. The bottom tore open, sending oranges, apples, and a container of fresh tofu tumbling to the ground. The oranges rolled in every direction across the asphalt. "Oh no," the tall one exclaimed with mock horror. "Look what you did. You really should be more careful." Margaret's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as she watched her groceries scatter. She bent down slowly, her knees protesting, to pick up what she could reach. The young men continued to laugh, kicking some of the oranges further away whenever she got close to them. "Come on, Grandma, move faster," one taunted. "We don't have all day to watch you crawl around." A small crowd had begun to gather at the edges of the parking lot. Some people stopped to watch, their faces showing concern, but no one stepped forward to help. A few pulled out their phones, either to call for help or to record what was happening. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to gather her scattered groceries. Her scarf had come loose and fallen to the ground, and one of the young men stepped on it deliberately, grinding it into the dirty pavement. "Nice outfit," he sneered. "Is that what they're wearing in the nursing home these days?" Tears of frustration welled up in Margaret's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give these bullies the satisfaction of seeing her cry. In all her years, she'd never felt so helpless, so vulnerable. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "just let me go home." "Ah, she wants to go home," the stocky one mocked in a baby voice. "Maybe we should call her an ambulance, or better yet, a hearse." They laughed even harder at this cruel joke, high-fiving each other as if they'd accomplished something great. Margaret's groceries lay scattered around her feet, bruised fruit, crushed vegetables, and broken containers, creating a mess on the pavement. The tall one pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is going to be hilarious on TikTok," he said. #GrandmaFails. Margaret tried once more to gather her things, but every time she reached for something, one of them would kick it away or step on it. Her favorite ceramic jar of homemade pickles shattered when the stocky one accidentally knocked it from her hands. Just then, a deep shadow fell across the scene. The laughter suddenly stopped, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Someone was approaching from behind the young men, and from the look on the bystanders' faces, whoever it was commanded immediate attention. Margaret, still on her knees trying to salvage what she could, didn't notice the change in atmosphere at first. She was too focused on picking up the remains of her groceries, her hands trembling with age and emotion. But she would soon discover that help was arriving from the most unexpected source. Vin Diesel had just finished his coffee and was heading back to the movie set. He wore his usual casual outfit, a simple black t-shirt that showed his muscular arms, dark jeans, and sunglasses that hid his famous eyes. Most people walking by didn't recognize him, which was exactly how he liked it during his breaks. As he turned the corner near the grocery store parking lot, something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just some kids horsing around. But then he heard the mocking laughter and saw an elderly woman on her knees, surrounded by scattered groceries. Vin stopped in his tracks. His jaw tightened as he watched the scene unfold. 3 young men were circling the woman like sharks, kicking her groceries and laughing at her struggles. His grip on his coffee cup tightened until the cardboard sleeve crumpled. For exactly 10 seconds, Vin observed the situation. Those 10 seconds told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't playful behavior. This was bullying, plain and simple. The woman's trembling hands, the tears she was trying to hide, the way she kept her head down in shame, it all painted a clear picture. In those 10 seconds, memories flashed through Vin's mind. His own grandmother, who had raised him when times were tough. The values she had taught him about respect, especially for elders. The countless times she had told him that real strength wasn't about muscles or fighting, it was about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The 10th second ticked by, and Vin made his decision. He set his coffee cup down on a nearby bench and started walking toward the group. His footsteps were silent but purposeful, like a panther approaching its prey. The bystanders noticed him first. A few recognized him immediately, his distinctive walk, his powerful presence. Whispers started spreading through the small crowd. "Is that? Oh my God, it's him. That's Vin Diesel." But Vin wasn't thinking about being recognized. His focus was entirely on the elderly woman and her tormentors. As he got closer, he could hear more clearly what they were saying. "Maybe we should start a GoFundMe to buy Grandma a wheelchair," one of them was joking. "Nah, she needs a time machine to go back where she belongs," another replied. They were so caught up in their cruel game that they didn't notice the approaching figure until his shadow fell over them. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as Vin's presence filled the space. The laughter died instantly. The young man with the backwards cap was the first to turn around, his smirk freezing on his face. His eyes traveled up from Vin's chest to his face, and even through the sunglasses, he could feel the intensity of Vin's stare. "Hush," one of them started to say, but caught himself. Vin stood there, silent and imposing. He didn't need to flex or posture. His mere presence was enough to command attention. Years of playing tough characters on screen had taught him that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Margaret was still focused on gathering her groceries, unaware of the sudden change in atmosphere. She reached for a bruised apple, her hand shaking slightly. That's when she noticed that the mocking voices had stopped. The parking lot had gone eerily quiet. Slowly, she looked up. The first thing she saw was a pair of large, well-worn boots. Her gaze traveled upward, taking in the muscular figure standing between her and her tormentors. Even from her position on the ground, she could sense the protective energy radiating from this stranger. The three young men had backed up slightly, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly recognizing who had interrupted their fun. Vin removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that burned with controlled anger. He hooked the glasses on his shirt collar and took one more step forward. The young men instinctively took another step back. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger now. Phone cameras were pointed at the scene, capturing what was about to become a viral moment. But Vin paid no attention to the cameras. His grandmother had taught him that doing the right thing wasn't about getting credit, it was about being the person you were meant to be. In that moment, surrounded by scattered groceries and faced with three bullies, Vin Diesel wasn't a movie star. He was simply a man who had witnessed an injustice and decided that enough was enough. Without saying a word, Vin walked straight toward Margaret. The three young men parted like the Red Sea, too stunned to maintain their tough act. He knelt down beside the elderly woman, his large frame somehow becoming gentle and non-threatening. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked softly, his deep voice carrying none of the anger he felt toward the bullies. He reached out and carefully helped her to her feet, supporting her elbow with surprising tenderness. Margaret looked up at her helper, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the famous face. But what struck her more than his celebrity status was the genuine concern in his eyes. "Thank you, young man," she said, brushing off her clothes with as much dignity as she could muster. "These boys were just..." She paused, not wanting to make the situation worse. "I saw what they were doing," Vin replied, still keeping his voice calm and controlled. He turned to face the three young men, positioning himself protectively between them and Margaret. The tallest one tried to salvage some pride. "Hey man, we were just joking around. No big deal, right?" Vin's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted. The atmosphere grew heavier. "Joking around?" he repeated, his voice low and steady. "Is that what you call making an elderly woman crawl on the ground to pick up her groceries?" The young men shuffled their feet, unable to meet his gaze. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and several people were now live-streaming the encounter. "Look," the stocky one attempted, "we didn't mean any harm. We're huge fans of yours, actually. Can we get a selfie?" The audacity of the request made several bystanders gasp. Vin's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his composure. Instead of responding to the ridiculous request, he bent down and started picking up Margaret's scattered groceries. "The only thing you're going to do," he said without looking up, "is help clean up this mess you've made." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. The three young men hesitated for a moment, then slowly began to pick up the groceries they had scattered. Vin supervised their every move, making sure they handled each item with care. "The oranges are over there," he directed, pointing to where they had rolled under a car. "And be careful with that container, it's already cracked." Margaret watched in amazement as the same young men who had tormented her now scrambled to collect her groceries. One of them found her scarf and tried to hand it to Vin, but he shook his head. "Give it to her directly," he instructed. and apologize properly. The young man approached Margaret hesitantly, holding out her scarf. I'm sorry, ma'am, he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. Louder, Vin prompted, and look at her when you speak. The young man raised his head, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry for what we did, ma'am. It was wrong and disrespectful. His friends followed suit, each offering their own awkward apologies. Margaret accepted them with quiet grace, though the hurt in her eyes remained. Once all the salvageable groceries were collected, Vin personally checked each bag to make sure they were properly packed. Several items were beyond saving: crushed vegetables, broken jars, bruised fruit. You'll need to replace these, he told the young men, pulling out his wallet. But Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. No, please, she said. You've done enough. More than enough. Vin smiled at her, the first real smile since he'd arrived on the scene. At least let me help you carry these to your car. I walked here, Margaret explained. I live just a few blocks away. Without hesitation, Vin picked up her grocery bags. Then I'll walk with you. Make sure you get home safely. The three young men stood there awkwardly, unsure if they were dismissed. Vin turned to them one last time, his expression serious but not angry. You should think about what happened here today, he said, and remember this moment the next time you see someone who needs help instead of harassment. As Vin and Margaret began to walk away, the crowd parted respectfully. Some people applauded, others continued filming, but Vin paid them no attention. His focus remained on the elderly woman beside him, making sure she felt safe and respected. The three bullies were left standing in the parking lot, surrounded by disapproving stares from the crowd. Their moment of fun had turned into a very public lesson in humility. Without saying a word, Vin walked straight toward Margaret. The three young men parted like the Red Sea, too stunned to maintain their tough act. He knelt down beside the elderly woman, his large frame somehow becoming gentle and non-threatening. Ma'am, aren't you all right? He asked softly, his deep voice carrying none of the anger he felt toward the bullies. He reached out and carefully helped her to her feet, supporting her elbow with surprising tenderness. Margaret looked up at her helper, her eyes widening slightly as she recognized the famous face. But what struck her more than his celebrity status was the genuine concern in his eyes. Thank you, young man, she said, brushing off her clothes with as much dignity as she could muster. These boys were just. She paused, not wanting to make the situation worse. I saw what they were doing, Vin replied, still keeping his voice calm and controlled. He turned to face the three young men, positioning himself protectively between them and Margaret. The tallest one tried to salvage some pride. Hey man, we were just joking around. No big deal, right? Vin's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted. The atmosphere grew heavier. Joking around? He repeated, his voice low and steady. Is that what you call making an elderly woman crawl on the ground to pick up her groceries? The young men shuffled their feet, unable to meet his gaze. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, and several people were now live-streaming the encounter. Look, the stocky one attempted. We didn't mean any harm. We're huge fans of yours, actually. Can we get a selfie? The audacity of the request made several bystanders gasp. Vin's eyes narrowed slightly, but he maintained his composure. Instead of responding to the ridiculous request, he bent down and started picking up Margaret's scattered groceries. The only thing you're going to do, he said without looking up, is help clean up this mess you've made. The authority in his voice left no room for argument. The three young men hesitated for a moment, then slowly began to pick up the groceries they had scattered. Vin supervised their every move, making sure they handled each item with care. The oranges are over there, he directed, pointing to where they had rolled under a car. And be careful with that container, it's already cracked. Margaret watched in amazement as the same young men who had tormented her now scrambled to collect her groceries. One of them found her scarf and tried to hand it to Vin, but he shook his head. Give it to her directly, he instructed, and apologize properly. The young man approached Margaret hesitantly, holding out her scarf. I'm sorry, ma'am, he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. Louder, Vin prompted, and look at her when you speak. The young man raised his head, his face flushed with embarrassment. I'm sorry for what we did, ma'am. It was wrong and disrespectful. His friends followed suit, each offering their own awkward apologies. Margaret accepted them with quiet grace, though the hurt in her eyes remained. Once all the salvageable groceries were collected, Vin personally checked each bag to make sure they were properly packed. Several items were beyond saving: crushed vegetables, broken jars, bruised fruit. "You'll need to replace these," he told the young men, pulling out his wallet. But Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "No, please," she said. "You've done enough. More than enough." Vin smiled at her, the first real smile since he'd arrived on the scene. "At least let me help you carry these to your car." "I walked here," Margaret explained. "I live just a few blocks away." Without hesitation, Vin picked up her grocery bags. "Then I'll walk with you. Make sure you get home safely." The three young men stood there awkwardly, unsure if they were dismissed. Vin turned to them one last time, his expression serious but not angry. "You should think about what happened here today," he said, "and remember this moment the next time you see someone who needs help instead of harassment." As Vin and Margaret began to walk away, the crowd parted respectfully. Some people applauded, others continued filming, but Vin paid them no attention. His focus remained on the elderly woman beside him, making sure she felt safe and respected. The three bullies were left standing in the parking lot, surrounded by disapproving stares from the crowd. Their moment of fun had turned into a very public lesson in humility. As Vin and Margaret started to walk away, something made him pause. He turned back to face the three young men who were still standing there looking lost and ashamed. The crowd watched silently, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Wait a minute," Vin called out, his voice firm but not harsh. "Come here, all three of you." The young men exchanged worried glances before slowly approaching. They stopped a few feet away, their heads down, shoulders slumped. The contrast between their earlier arrogance and current humility was striking. Vin gently set down Margaret's grocery bags and faced them directly. "Do you know what real strength is?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the now quiet parking lot. The tallest one shrugged, still unable to meet Vin's eyes. "Being tough, I guess." Vin shook his head slowly. "No. Real strength is about protecting those who need help, not preying on them." He gestured toward Margaret. "This woman has probably lived through more challenges than you can imagine. She deserves your respect, not your mockery." Margaret stood quietly beside him, touched by his words, but also feeling somewhat uncomfortable being the center of attention. She'd always been a private person, and this public scene was overwhelming. "Look at her," Vin continued, his voice softening slightly. "Really look at her. This could be your grandmother, your mother someday, or anyone you care about. How would you feel if someone treated them the way you treated her?" The stocky young man finally looked up, his eyes meeting Margaret's for the first time. What he saw there, a mixture of hurt, dignity, and forgiveness, made him swallow hard. We didn't think about it like that," he admitted quietly. "That's the problem," Vin responded. "You didn't think at all. You saw someone vulnerable and thought it would be fun to make them feel small. But real men, real people with character, they lift others up. They don't tear them down." The crowd had grown even larger now, with people recording every word. But this wasn't about viral content for Vin. This was about teaching a lesson that these young men desperately needed to learn. "You know what's really cool?" Vin continued, his tone becoming more conversational. "Helping others, being kind. Standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. That's what makes you strong. Not this," he gestured to their expensive clothes and phones, "and definitely not picking on people who can't fight back." The young man with the backwards cap spoke up, his voice shaky. "We're really sorry. We were just bored and stupid." "Bored?" Vin raised an eyebrow. "Let me tell you something about boredom. When I was your age, if I was bored, I'd go volunteer at a community center, help out at a food bank, visit elderly neighbors who might need someone to talk to. There are a million ways to deal with boredom that don't involve hurting others." Margaret finally spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Young men, I taught high school for 35 years. I've seen all kinds of students, the bullies, the bullied, and everyone in between. The ones who turned out best were those who learned to treat others with kindness." Her words seemed to hit home. The three young men looked genuinely affected by her gentle wisdom. "You have a choice now," Vin added. You can walk away from here and forget this ever happened, go back to being the kind of people who find entertainment in others' pain. Or you can remember this moment and choose to be better. He paused, letting his words sink in. The world has enough bullies. What we need are more protectors, more helpers, more people who give a damn about others. One of the bystanders started clapping, and soon others joined in. But Vin held up his hand, stopping the applause. "This isn't about me being a hero," he said. "This is about these young men choosing who they want to be from this moment forward." He turned back to the three. "So what's it going to be? Are you going to keep being the guys who push people down, or are you going to start being the ones who lift them up?" The three young men looked at each other, then back at Vin and Margaret. Something had shifted in their expressions. The cockiness was gone, replaced by what looked like genuine remorse, and maybe even the beginning of understanding. "We want to do better," the tallest one said, and this time his voice carried conviction. "We'll do better." Vin nodded, a slight smile appearing on his face. "That's a start. But remember, words are easy. It's actions that count." The parking lot scene had attracted quite a crowd, and dozens of phones were still recording as Vin picked up Margaret's grocery bags once more. The three young men stood there, looking uncertain about what to do next, their earlier swagger completely gone. "Mr. Diesel," Margaret said softly, touching his arm. "You don't have to carry my groceries. You've already done so much." "Please call me Vin," he replied with a warm smile. "And I insist. My grandmother would never forgive me if I didn't see you safely home." As they began walking, Margaret noticed one of the young men, the one with the baseball cap, stepping forward hesitantly. "Wait," he called out. Can we help carry those bags? To make up for what we did." Vin paused, studying the young man's face. He saw genuine remorse there, not just embarrassment at being caught. After a moment he nodded. That would be a good start. The three young men quickly came forward, each taking a bag from Vin. As the unusual group began walking together, a Hollywood star, an elderly Chinese woman, and three humbled bullies, people in the parking lot continued filming and taking pictures. Within minutes, the first video clips were already being uploaded to social media. The hashtags started trending. Hashtag #VinDieselHero, hashtag #RespectYourElders, hashtag RealStrength. What had started as a cruel prank was quickly becoming a viral lesson in human decency. "I live just 3 blocks this way," Margaret directed, pointing down the street. As they walked, she began to relax, even chatting with the young men about her plans for the dumplings she was going to make. "My grandmother used to make dumplings too," the stocky young man admitted. "I haven't had homemade ones since she passed away." "Well," Margaret said, her teacher instincts kicking in, "maybe you should learn to make them yourself. It's not that hard, and it's a wonderful way to keep her memory alive." The conversation continued as they walked, the tension from earlier completely dissolved. Vin watched with satisfaction as the young men listened respectfully to Margaret's stories about her years as a teacher, her family, and her love of cooking. When they reached Margaret's apartment building, a small, well-maintained complex with flowering plants on the balconies, her neighbors were already outside. Word had spread fast through text messages and social media, and several people had gathered to make sure she was okay. "Mrs. Chen, we saw what happened online. Are you all right?" called out a concerned neighbor. "I'm fine, dear," Margaret replied, beaming. "Thanks to this kind gentleman and these young men who are helping me with my groceries." The neighbors stared in amazement at Vin Diesel standing there in their ordinary apartment complex, helping their friend. A few asked for photos, which he politely agreed to, but only after making sure Margaret was comfortable. The three young men carried the groceries up to Margaret's second-floor apartment. As they set the bags down in her small but tidy kitchen, she turned to them with a gentle smile. "Would you boys like to stay for tea?" she offered. "I have some cookies I baked yesterday." They looked at each other, then at Vin, who nodded encouragingly. "We'd like that," the tallest one said, "if it's not too much trouble." And so, in a strange turn of events, the 5 of them sat around Margaret's dining table, sharing tea and cookies. The young men learned that Margaret had been a chemistry teacher, that she had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, and that she volunteered at the local library twice a week. "You know," Margaret said, looking at the 3 young men, "I've had many students like you over the years. Good kids who sometimes made bad choices, The important thing is what you do next. Before leaving, Vin exchanged phone numbers with Margaret, promising to check on her. The young men also left their contact information, offering to help her with grocery shopping in the future. As they all stood at Margaret's door saying goodbye, Vin turned to the young men one last time. "Remember what happened today," he said. "Not the embarrassment, but the lesson. Every person you meet deserves respect, regardless of their age or appearance." The tallest young man extended his hand to shake Vin's. "We won't forget," he promised. "And thank you for stopping us from being the worst versions of ourselves." When they finally left Margaret's apartment, the sun was setting. The parking lot incident had been transformed into something none of them had expected, a moment of genuine human connection. The videos were already going viral, but the real story was the change that had occurred in 3 young hearts, and the reminder that sometimes heroes appear exactly when they needed most. Within 24 hours, the parking lot video had been viewed over 10 million times. News channels picked up the story, calling it "the day Vin Diesel became a real-life hero." But what happened next surprised everyone, including Vin himself. The 3 young men appeared on local news the following week, not to seek attention, but to share how the incident had changed them. They spoke honestly about their behavior, their shame, and their commitment to making things right. "We were bullies," the tallest one admitted on camera. "There's no other word for it. We picked on someone vulnerable because we thought it was fun. It took Mr. Diesel's intervention to show us how wrong we were." True to their word, they began volunteering at the local senior center, where Margaret often spent her afternoons. At first, the other elderly folks were wary of them, having heard about the incident. But Margaret vouched for them, telling everyone, "People deserve second chances. These boys are proving they've learned their lesson." Vin, moved by the genuine transformation he witnessed, decided to take action on a larger scale. He used his platform to launch the Respect Always campaign, focusing on protecting elderly citizens from harassment and abuse. The campaign included public service announcements featuring Vin and Margaret, community workshops on elder respect and protection, a hotline for reporting elder abuse, self-defense classes specifically designed for seniors. Margaret became the unexpected face of the campaign. Her gentle wisdom and forgiving nature touched hearts across the country. She appeared in interviews, always emphasizing the importance of kindness and second chances. "I never expected my weekly grocery trip to turn into all this," she would say with a laugh. "But if my experience can help prevent others from being bullied, then something good came from that difficult day." The 3 young men became regular volunteers at the senior center. The one with the baseball cap learned to make dumplings from Margaret and started teaching cooking classes for other seniors. The stocky one began driving elderly residents to their medical appointments. The third started a technology help desk, teaching seniors how to use smartphones and computers. 6 months after the incident, Vin returned to the neighborhood for a special event. The local community had organized a Respect Always festival in the park near Margaret's apartment. Hundreds of people showed up, families, seniors, teenagers, and community leaders. The highlight of the day was when the 3 young men presented Vin and Margaret with a check for $50,000, money they had raised through community car washes, bake sales, and crowdfunding. The funds were donated to establish a permanent senior advocacy program in their city. "This is what happens when people choose to change," Vin told the crowd. "These young men made a mistake, but they owned it, learned from it, and turned it into something positive. That's what real strength looks like." Margaret, standing beside him, added, "In my years of teaching, I always believed that every student had the potential for greatness. Sometimes they just need someone to show them the way." The festival ended with a community dinner where Margaret taught dozens of people how to make her famous dumplings. The 3 young men were her assistants, proudly wearing aprons that read "Margaret's Kitchen Crew." A year later, the impact continued to grow. The Respect Always campaign had spread to 12 cities. The 3 young men were now peer counselors at their local high school, sharing their story with students and teaching about the dangers of bullying. They had also started a YouTube channel dedicated to promoting kindness and respect, with Margaret as their regular guest star. Vin kept in touch with everyone, occasionally surprising them with visits. He often said that the parking lot incident was one of the most meaningful moments of his life, not because he got to play hero, but because he witnessed the incredible power of redemption and the ripple effect of choosing kindness. As for Margaret, she continued her weekly grocery trips, but now she was often accompanied by her adopted grandsons, the same 3 young men who had once made her feel so small. Their relationship had become a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of change. The story that began with cruelty in a parking lot had transformed into a movement of compassion, proving that sometimes the most powerful scenes aren't the ones scripted for movies, but the ones that unfold in real life when people choose to stand up for what's right.